So, what do you think of when you hear the term romantic? Is it fair to call it a pejorative term? I think it certainly has pejorative aspects to it. Um, suggesting kind of soft headed, impractical, hysterical. It's associated with a kind of, at least, lack of masculinity, lack of realism, living in the imagination, living in the past. It takes its name from romance, like medieval romance. It's a modern term. It's defined by the pre-modern. So, and it was, I think, originates as a term of derision. It was applied to these new romantic period writers writing in the wake of the French Revolution, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. Gothic, sensational, fantastical romances, as if they were actual medieval romances. Calls or foreshadows um, our interest in fantasy, um, in Game of Thrones style, um, medievalism, looking in the past, for alternative worlds, fantasy play, alternative identities in the imagination. Um, so, an interesting aspect of romanticism is its uh, conglomeration of all these different tensions. It's a political movement. It's inspired by the French Revolution. It's like democracy, personal freedom, rationality, the liberation of the human mind from superstition, the oppressive superstition of institutional religion. These are really basic aspects of the Romantic movement that we'll, see right from the beginning throughout all the writers that we look at. Romanticism is a reaction against Enlightenment and science, but it's not a wholesale rejection of Enlightenment science. It Romanticism does not reject reason, and it does not reject critical analysis. But it rejects the hegemony of reason, monolithic worldview of the Enlightenment. Um, Romanticism is invested in opposition, difference, a key word that we'll look at in one of these first few poems that she dwelt among the untrodden ways. Difference for its own sake. Worlds cannot be entirely rationalized and made coherent and understandable in the way science and some versions of science aspires to do. Um, so the interplay of rationality and imagination and emotion and reason um, are that form of interplay is more important to the Romantics than taking sides one way or another. The form of ambivalence, ambiguity, irony is probably the key term of this of Romanticism and of this class. Um, Romantics, if there's one sort of stylistic signature and principle that the Romantics adhere to, it's irony, and that serves is their investment in freedom, the freedom of the reader. An ironic text is a text that defies closure, defies a particular definitive reading. Um, It's always open to new acts of reading. Also has to do with the romantic investment in action, that freedom is something we do in the world. It's not an abstract value, it's a practical value. And so in these texts, as invested as the Romantics are in literature and art, that's an investment that they want to serve life. They want to serve the practical life of ordinary people. So this irony you can see already in the most iconic romantic painting probably by Caspar David Friedrich of the wanderer over the sea of fog, man on a mountaintop. Seems like couldn't be more kind of monumentally heroic. And yet it's faceless, and provocatively empty. It's a kind of proto-modernist in its display of blankness, emptiness. It's kind of a yin and yang, chiaroscuro contrast of the black and white. The predominance of form over content. All these kind of undermine the supposed, triumph of the man on the mountaintop, and supplant that definitive triumph, image of conquest, with questions about the act of looking, asserting one's own perspective. It's not so ambiguously triumphant as it might seem. Disturbing indefiniteness, and getting tossed and torn about by these fragments of cloud, like the wind. But this is also, this emptiness, it's also an occasion for performance, or sort of feeling oneself. This is what the probably second most important romantic term, the sublime, means. What's sublime is what subverts definition. It's like subliminal. It's kind of defies representation. So we can say that about the horizon here. It goes off in infinity, that infinitude, that lack of definition, lack of limit. Define means to put a boundary to. The illimitable, the infinite, with lack of finitude, is what lacks a boundary or a limit or a definition. This endlessness is a key aspect of this painting, and romantic art in general tends to evoke what defies definition. The media of art is used against itself to evoke things that jump out of the frame, defy that definition, delimitation, or boundary. But this, it represents for the Romantics the sublime, a new way of talking about freedom, the sublime and modernity, the modern experience of being in the moment, being me here now. It's really in contrast to maybe pre-modern, old-fashioned, medieval uses of the sublime to sort of evoke, the power of God, heaven and hell. Hierarchical authorities like the king, the Pope, the Church, the priest, um, that we used to think of as exercising ultimate powers, addressing the ultimate questions of life and death. Um, that power devolves now to the individual, a member of the public, the citizen. Um, and our experience, the ordinary experience, the ordinary person's experience of the sublime becomes important. There's no one to tell us anymore what the ultimate experience is for, what life and death are for. We're left, the individual mind becomes the ultimate adjudicator of, the good and the true, the ultimate questions. So the sublime here, it's an invitation to realize, our individual freedom, and social equality. We stand on the mountaintop. We are looking at this painting. Our looking at this painting is just as valid. It's an analogous experience to that of the man on the mountaintop himself. We don't stand below him, but side by side, in analogy, in the face of this sublime. No one tells us how to be ourselves, what our lives are for. The and hence, art is used to undermine political hierarchy, suggesting that we could be on the same level as the conqueror, the imperial conqueror, the aristocrat, but also that romantic art takes away the hierarchy within art itself between artist and audience. The audience is invited to activate its own creativity, rather than just passively receive the creativity of the artist. The artist invites the audience into a kind of collaboration or a conversation among equals. So I think this, although Romanticism suggests grandiosity, I think it actually has to do with a kind of humility that's a really important part of Romantic art, and subsequent cultural movements. I think that's a better way of talking about Romanticism, is as a cultural movement rather than an artistic like school. It's and it's specifically subcultural. So, and I think so. I'd compare Romanticism to other kinds of cultural movements that appropriate derogatory terms. I don't know, punk, queer, are terms that are pejorative, but that are appropriated in a creative way in order to assert a new kind of subjectivity that defies an old standard by subverting it. So what was your term of derision becomes my term of self-assertion. So it's overturning the basic premise of what it means to be powerful, what it means to have a voice. Is it getting troubled? So let's take a couple examples to introduce us into how Romanticism works. So Romanticism, I suggested, is kind of a throwback. It's very self-consciously appropriating this and antiquated, obsolete art for a time whose modernity is much like our own. Um, it's Romanticism really is the beginning of time in which our world is basically inaugurated. We make such a big deal about the democratic revolutions, capitalism and consumerism, industrialism, um, all these basic elements that define our experience, both positively and negative, and individualism. And you see here Wordsworth emphasizing anonymity. Um, Wordsworth and romantics generally make great use of anonymity, speaking about people in terms of pronouns. Um, Brings to mind another, defining modern cultural movement, the Beatles, who are very famous for the innovation of their lyrics to sort of use a lot of different pronouns, not just not just sing like Frank Sinatra about like addressing the beloved as you, but using third person, she loves you, like using this kind of drama theater of impersonal pronouns, the dramatically complex narrative Beatles lyrics offered, but remaining anonymous. Popular culture remains anonymous, but the complexity of the stories, the experience of love becomes more subtle and complex without denying its essential anonymity. That's what modern pop culture is, These, in contrast to the troubadours who, performed in this intimate, personal context. Modern popular culture, still addressing love, it's still addressing all the same passions, but it's doing it to a mass audience. And so we have to acknowledge this kind of conflict between this tension of the intimately personal and the and essentially, generic. We fall in love to these pop songs that, thousands or millions of others are falling in love to. She dwelt among the untrodden ways. So, she, beginning with she's, is provocatively incoherent, like impossible to know off the bat who the she refers to. We're even given the proper name of the river before we're told the proper who the proper person is, who the she refers to. Indeed, we don't get her name until we learn that she's dead. So there's in the very last stanza, so weirdly suggesting that the proper name somehow is correlated with cancellation, negation. Like once she gets named as a distinct individual, Lucy, it's only in order to bury her. It says an epitaph that she's properly named. It's so again, it's almost as if we live in this anonymous, generic identity of the she, the indeterminate she. But as you read this first stanza, what's striking is the complexity of Wordsworth's characterization of this anonymity. It's not an empty non-identity. It's a very complex non-identity. So all these formulations, in a way, are just elaborating anonymity, the lack of an identity. So she dwelt among the untrodden ways. Like, what is it, untrodden way? Like, he's inviting us to find a way to imagine her that's not a way, that's untrodden, that isn't taken. So he, instead of giving us a positive characterization of a character, he's presenting us with paradoxes to play with, the unknowability of other people. Um, and so every seemingly positive characterization he offers, he actually undermines, realizes is negative. What is a maid? Maiden, like girl, like virgin, unmature, not yet a woman, potential woman, that without praise, lacking love. He's giving us like a ghost, the absence of all these positive qualities. The most marginal kind of person, sexually marginalized by her gender, um, marginalized by her age as a child, economically in the woods. It's interesting how Wordsworth is approaching character um, demographically in a way, like as the marginal of the perspective on the margins of all these basic social categories like gender, age, class. It's inviting us to think personhood in terms of that conventionally deprive people of personhood. Um, Wordsworth really, in this sense, I think, is speaking to our um, conversation today about lives, whose lives matter, whose perspective matters. Paradoxes that make the reader reflect on how we would know her. Um, it's again like Me Too and Black Lives Matter. These are movements concerned with systemic sexism, systemic racism. What does that systemic mean? Um, it means that it's integral to not just individual acts, but a whole system of communication, a whole cultural system, way of understanding and recognizing objective reality has this prejudice built into it. It's systemic. You can't speak in our system, our cultural system, our social system, without participating in this violence. It goes beyond individual acts of violence, but is integral to, implicit in the system. So that's what Wordsworth is doing when he's making us reflect on how our own minds construct or would recognize individuality. He's showing the systemic conditions of personhood. It makes us aware of our own mental activity. So a half-hidden flower confronts us with our expectations of a flower, because we don't just see the flower. We it's a kind of back and forth between what we see and what we expect to see, but don't entirely see. Same thing with the one star in the sky. It's like the morning star, the evening star. It's the last one left or the first to appear. It's an event rather than just an object, and so it makes us reflect on our intentionality, our expectations, our memory. An interesting question to think about here in this poem is Wordsworth's making us aware of a kind of systemic presumptions, requirements, what it means to be a recognizable person. Is he critical or is he exploiting um, these systemic, is he participating in this systemic violence, this systemic sexism, exploitation, the girl's beauty and purity? Is this sort of self-reflexivity just heightening our exploitation of this girl's reality, or is it making us more sensitive to it? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's an open question, but I want. How would you answer it, and why? Just point out how a couple, different things to notice about the final stanza. As I already said, it's a kind of a murder, or even a kind of vampire consumption of the of Lucy seems to take place. He names her the same moment he buries her. She becomes the poem becomes itself. It becomes an elegy. At the same moment that she ceases to be, the poem kind of consumes her. The poet consumes her in order to speak his poem, you could say. Correspondingly, the last word is me. It's about an assertion of me. Made a difference to me. It's about this experience, this event, within myself. So you could say it's a very solipsistic celebration of the poet's experience at the expense, systemically requiring the girl's death in order to speak this truth, assert this poetic truth about the poet's own self. On the other hand, I think you might make a case that there's something self-consuming about the poem, about the poet. The poet himself becomes generic, just the generic me, too speaks generically, but the difference to me. Is that a sign of poetic impotence? The difference, the difference to me. What is that saying? But it's kind of a non-saying. It's saying I can't say it. It's just different. Maybe the very emptiness of that exclamation, is preserving a kind of sublimity. She's just sheer difference. That arguably the solipsism, selfishness, self-egotism of the poem goes hand in hand with its kind of radical respect of her radical otherness. The way in which the poem seems to collapse into the I, the self-identical poet, also maybe keeps infinite space open for difference itself, to just be different. Difference. What could that be? It could be anything. And again, finally, maybe the point is the music, is the kind of rhythm of this interplay back and forth. A test demonstrating the limits of our own understanding, but thereby performing a kind of model of social relationship as music, forging a way, a kind of poetic dance or music that could forge and communication, social recognition of this marginalized perspective. The infinite plays a key role here too. It's as if he's describing the wandering clouds floating through infinite space. Wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. Personification of nature is flagrant, cartoonish even, evoking precisely the fantasy of personified nature. It's not personifying it in a way that's asking us to take it seriously. It's a visionary personification. The experience of fantasizing about it. That's what visionary means. It's like a relishing the intoxication. It's like a hallucination that enjoying the fantasy for its own sake. So again, a kind of reflection of an active mind, imagination in action. And Wordsworth, just as overtly, unsubtly, evokes the sublime. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of the bay. So it's like he's defining the sublime. He's not just enacting it. He's making us think, almost even as he's being cartoonishly simple. I think he's, inviting us to think in a explicitly theoretical way about, the concept of the never-ending line, and what that represents on a theoretical level. This reminds me of Blake a little bit, William Blake, who we'll be devoting a lot of attention to in this course, using a kind of childlike idiom to address sophisticated ideas. It's a kind of mock sublimity that we see here when he immediately puts a number to it, 10,000. That's, I think, very provocative. It's, again, much like Blake, this again has a very timely historical correlate of the democratic revolution, sort of the census, the number of the crowd, the public. How do you count the public, the number in their numbers? Is the public just a collection, a certain number of individuals? Or is it its own identity, does it contain its own sublimity? Is the crowd kind of an identity unto itself? Wordsworth is very provocatively evoking this political subtext, the subtext of the 10,000, of the number, of the crowd. And he's also juxtaposing, I think, more worldly, on the one hand, and a more transcendent notion of the poet and the poem. There's the poet that he names, that, poet could not but be gay in such jocund company. But then he says, actually, I was missing the point. This dancing, that's sort of the superficial pleasure of the poet, to bear witness to these dancing flowers, that's not actually the real deep pleasure I only got later. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. The real meaning and value comes only subsequent recollection. That's really key, Wordsworthian term. The rehearsal. These terms recollect, rehearse, they evoke a kind of dancing or music of the mind itself, inward eye. But from the beginning was this interplay of imagination and reality, personifying nature, counting the sublime. It is not for Wordsworth supposed to resolve to one side or the other, but the point is its refinement of the interplay, rehearsing, recollecting, and in solitude, the dance becomes even more vivid. Again, much like Blake, although it seems to be about these dualistic categories, the crowd, the solitude, politics and nature, poetry and reality. It's really about a kind of texture and rhythm of experience in general. Um, they can't be reduced either to the political or the sheerly natural. It's about the way in which politics and nature are always interplaying, mutually informing society and individuality, or imagination and reality, the sublime, the infinite, and the finite. It's a children's poem. It's very simple, but its power is in how it troubles these categories of um, it's the sophisticated versus the naive. It's typical of Wordsworth's poetry that there's a kind of shock that comes with the experience of the music of the poem itself. All of a sudden, you're sort of seduced by the rhythm and rhyme scheme, to realize, oh, I'm dancing along too, just in the very act of reading. We realize that politics, identity, um, society, these are categories that we engage not just on a deliberate, conscious, intellectual level, but that are in play in even in our bodies, in our experience of our breath, of the rhythm of the rhyme. This is a basic dance of existence. Is at play in our experience of the rhythm of language, of rhyme, of poetry, um, and of thinking and recollecting. So radical, political questions are raised by the experience of reading, and there's a kind of power in the experience of these questions, and the open-endedness. The questions are politically destabilizing. Part of the suggestion here is that a lot of what democracy is a consequence of this negative function, just sort of destabilizing normal or familiar categories and hierarchies of thought, opening questions that maybe democratic subjectivity is not about knowledge, or control the way monarchy and the church dogma were. But it's more about this experience of the poetry of questioning, questionability. Of questionability anticipates a famous idea of the poet John Keats, negative capability. That there's a power, an ability, a capability in the negative, critical, posing questions. By loosening up, making dynamic, thawing what seemed rigid and unquestionable, by making it dynamic and interactive. There's a power in that very exposure, just the posing of questions rather than asserting answers, a negative capability. I think I suggested earlier that this painting evokes a kind of rhythm of mind, might even be compared to dancing. Interplay of the figure within the painting and my own perspective on that figure. The activity, watching is a kind of activity, doesn't define a new identity, but enacts identity in a new way as a performance. If you've ever participated in a, demonstration or a march or just even a concert, going to dancing, identifying with the crowd as the experience itself. Participating in a political demonstration. Here's a famous painting, but it's a demonstration at St. Peter's Field, Manchester, for universal suffrage. Percy Shelley's poem England in 1819 refers to this. these Fijian hats represent the French revolutionaries. There's a kind of performative identity that comes with political activity, arguably being in the crowd, feeling defined by a collective movement. Identity that doesn't transcend the performance, but just is about the performance itself. It's a different kind of politics. It's not the politics of having an opinion or a certain theory, but it's about the experience of being in the crowd itself, dancing with the crowd. Identity not as something timelessly possessed and abstract, but something enacted, embodied, the rhythm, the self as a kind of rhythm. And it's, in Wordsworth, it's likened to rhyme, That's what mediates that participation in the crowd for the reader. The experience, the embodied experience of the rhythm and rhyme of the poem. Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, which we'll read, emphasizes that poetry stands or falls with pleasure. Like dancing, it's just what makes us keep reading a poem is pleasure. If we keep reading, it's because it gives us pleasure. The meaning is secondary. It's about the music, the purpose in itself of the music and the dance. So the suggestion is a kind of intelligence of the body, communication of emotion through the dance and music of language. I think a great way of thinking about poetry is the body language of language. The way in which rhyme, the accidental rhythms and rhymes of words communicate meanings that interestingly play off against the abstract official meanings of words. I think that's what's at stake in a lot of these collective performances of crowds in modern democratic societies. The same can be said of Jane Austen, seen here on his portrait on the 10-pound note. Find this so ironic, given the ruthlessly critical perspective on money that we get in Jane Austen. There's a quote from Jane Austen from Pride and Prejudice here. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. So funny and perfectly exemplary of the pleasure in the rhythms of irony. Just like Wordsworth, her text inaugurates a new formal kind of complexity known as free indirect discourse. She basically invents a new, the modern form of the novel. That it is a lot about this interplay of anonymous perspectives. Like in the Beatles, I am he is, she is we, and we are all together like this. The omniscient narrator identifies, plays a kind of dance, moving in and out of various perspectives of her characters, speaking as if from within the first person perspective of the character the omniscient narrator is narrating about. So there's a very intricate poetic play and pleasure just in the texture of Austen's narration that I'd suggest, like in Wordsworth's play of perspectives and use of pronouns, is like a dance and yet very critical. It offers readers critical perspective on social norms, values like money. There's an intelligence in that critique, but it's all predicated on the pleasure of reading itself. Like this statement here Austen puts this statement there's no enjoyment like reading in the mouth of a character who is not a reader at all, but who's just a total poser. So that it emblematizes Austen's The Pleasure of Reading, and it subverts the attempt, kind of to appropriate her by the powers that be, putting her portrait on money. It demonstrates a kind of liberty of the reader's appreciation of irony. Creators of this 10-pound note, who would, appropriate Austen's image and words, would like us to read that statement on the surface level. There's no enjoyment like reading. The pleasure that Austen offers us is that meta ironic pleasure in recognizing that it actually, in context, this statement means exactly the opposite. The pleasure that Austen is asserting is not the one, I can't remember the characters' names, it's one of the Bingley sisters in Pride and Prejudice. Pleasure in our ability to read her hypocrisy. So that's formally much more complex and subtle, active, dynamic pleasure in being able to read these two meanings, opposed, contradictory meanings, off of one another. All right, so that's my introduction. Romanticism is a cultural movement, again, I think analogous to punk, whose power and appeal is political in its assertion of pleasure for the sake of subverting social hierarchies, normative categories. I'm really looking forward to exploring this more with you.